right, so we're on skills 5 now. This is the one that gets labeled as in-text citations because it's the cousin of the end citations that we discussed for skills 4. But now we're into the second half. And so this one through the end of the set of skills appear on the second skills assessment. This particular presentation is broader than the skill I'm going to test you on. Okay, so if you absolutely must slim down, the first major thing I talk about and the practice that goes with it at the end are the things to be focused on. Okay. However, this is sort of a general discussion of stylistics and scientific writing in sort of the middle part of this presentation. In a typical semester, I would have required you to write stuff, right? And these stylistics figure into that. But I can't responsibly and thoroughly do that for every single student when you're all online. It's very much a hands-on kind of skill. And we really need to be more face-to-face for me to do that effectively. However, I do want to give you the opportunity to learn this stuff, even if right now you're not practicing it directly. Okay, so this generally speaking, we're going to talk about stylistics, that is to say the how you write stuff, but the first section on in-text citation is important. Let me give you a list before we jump into the in-text citations about what kind of things am I thinking of when I say stylistics in scientific writing. Now, this stuff is it's most of the things you learn in, let's say, Writing 101 or whatever, are not irrelevant when you write scientifically, as it were, but they don't emphasize certain factors, because when we write for a scientific audience or even an academic audience, we're extremely interested in simplicity and clarity and directness, and effective communication takes precedence over all this sort of sounding nice stuff. Okay, and you'll see that kind of as we move along. So the most important thing in this list, and the thing I'm going to test you on, are in-text citations and APA. Okay, and you'll see in a second what those are. We'll talk a little bit about avoiding direct quotes, because in this style of writing, you do. We'll talk a little bit about the word this. I've made reference to this in the past. Every time I talk about this section, I always suddenly am very aware that every time I say the word this orally, because in speech, in English at the very least, we say the word this all the time because it's very natural to talk that way, but writing is problematic, and you'll see why. You'll avoid first-person language, so talking in I is a big no-no unless you're really established. There's some exceptions, but for the sake of you guys learning to do this, avoid it. Avoid weak language, and you'll see some examples of that. And then including section headers makes a big difference in this kind of writing, and you'll see an example of that too. So never would I grade you on this too, but if you're curious, there are some conventions about comma usage. It's not a big focus, really, but at some point it can help clarity as well. It depends. All right, so quotes, and even more importantly, in-text citations, because they kind of sync up. So in-text citations versus end citations. First, I want you to see what this distinction is. An in-text citation is the citation you make in your writing, right? So if I'm saying, well, according to Van Patten and Bonatti, parentheses, 2015, blah, 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 right? So if I want to talk about what the authors of our book are, what their assessments or opinions or what they said about a topic, this is how I would do it. I would say, according to so-and-so and so-and-so and the year, right? Or if I wanted to talk about their general an opinion about something and said, oh, research suggests it's ineffectual, parentheses, and then I can cite them directly. In that case, I'm talking about the example, and I'll give you more clarity on the distinction between these two examples. But sometimes the person or people show up in the sentence itself outside of parentheses, and sometimes they're in. But it's in the body of the paper, of the article, of the chapter, of whatever it is that you're writing. Whereas the end citations are the list of references works cited. And guess what? There's an end citation for every different paper cited in the text. And for the most part, you don't put things in the end citations that aren't cited in the text. So these guys actually work in parallel. If you cite you in the text, you got to show up in the end citations. Cite you in the text, show up in the end citations. There should be one, well, not literally one for one because you could cite the same thing multiple times in text. I could cite Van Patten and Bonatti on page 1, page 3, and page 7, or whatever, and maybe one time in the references. But there is a relationship. If it's in the text, it should be in the end citations, okay? Now, in-text citations, I've referenced this a little bit, but there's two kind of ways to use them. You can talk about the authors directly, which means they're part of the sentence structure. According to Van Patten and Bonatti, Einstein's theory of relativity, which means that if I weren't going to mention like things in parentheses, if I was reading out loud, I would not skip their names, right? It's if I were talking conversationally and not dropping years, I would still say their names. That's when I'm saying you're talking about them directly. Like, well, according to Van Patten and Bonatti, we'd never use blah, 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 right? Or, Einstein's theory of relativity, blah, 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 right? That's when we're talking about them directly, okay? But I could just talk about their idea or an idea related to them and use them as evidence, in which case it'd be equivalent to I wouldn't actually be saying their name, right? So let's imagine I was talking about, so Van Patten and Bonatti made claims about explicit information not being extremely useful, right? Or not primarily useless. So let's imagine I'm making a claim about that. Like, research suggests that explicit alone is ineffectual, right? So that's what the idea would be here. And if I'm talking more broadly, then I cite Van Patten and Bonatti in this case, I would say it's kind of like a for example. And sometimes you literally say for example, or see for example, or CF, or EG, or whatever. But that's the kind of way you would use it, right? And the same idea here, as appears in the theory of relativity, and then I cite Einstein because, like, that's who wrote it, but I'm talking about the theory. I'm not mentioning, so if I was talking about the theory of relativity, I don't have to talk about Einstein. I don't have to say his name anyway, right? I can talk about the theory and go, oh, by this person, and then keep going, right? So the idea is that if I were talking out loud and I was going to say their name, they're in this top bucket. And if I was talking out loud, implying their name, let's say, I'm in this bottom bucket, okay? I'm not in the sentence structure, okay? Now, you can vaguely see these have slightly different patterns of use. Now, the top one, as we saw, looks like this. And so the pattern is, if we're going to use them as part of the sentence structure, the authors are outside of any parentheses, author or authors, the year remains in parentheses, and if there's multiple authors, particularly if there's two, we'll see more in a second, if there's three or more, you'll put the word and, okay? Simple, no big, okay? Whereas, this is meant to parallel the previous one where they're both there, or the appearing is not the same, it's fine. Anyway, so if we're talking about the idea and they're not in the sentence structure, this is it's more common, actually. I think you do more of this, really. But anyway, the author or authors now appear inside the parentheses. The author, authors, and the year are separated by a comma. And instead of an and, you must use an ampersand, right? So if I go back to these examples from before, you can see the very first bullet point is Van Patten and Bonatti with the word and the third bullet point, it's parentheses, Van Patten ampersand. That little curly thing's called an ampersand, and Bonatti, okay? And so those are different. So up to this point, actually, and the next slide, let me finish the next slide and then I'll continue. We'll circle back to the quiz / homework / future assessments. So the last thing about this that you need to know are about the number of authors. So far, you've seen examples of one author and two author. And as I said, if they're in parentheses, it's an ampersand, and there's always a comma before the year. When it's three or more authors, it's the same way. It's a comma before the year, except for instead of listing more than one person, they just go et al. The story is more complex in reality, but let's stick to this version. Okay, this is gonna be the rules we're gonna behave by. What actually happens in an article is the first time you mention a paper with more than two authors, you will say them all, just as a manner of like giving credence to them. And then after that, they're et al, but we're just gonna pretend we've all done it once already and just stick to the et al. Because if you can do that correctly, it is, it's pretty good. Okay, and you'll notice here it's the first author, space, et al., period, comma, then year. The only difference if it's outside of parentheses for the 3 or more is, well, the comma is not there and just the year is in parentheses. Okay? All right. So up until this point, these are the things that you're responsible for in as the skill of this section. Okay? I'm about to talk about direct quotes briefly because it relates, but this is the skill portion of this particular piece. However, the practice, as I'm going to say in a second, the practice for this is at the end of this video. So if you do not value this stuff in the middle, which I don't know why you wouldn't, but maybe you don't, you can jump forward and practice real quick, okay? On quotes. So this kind of writing we're discussing, as far as an article is concerned, primarily pertains to the review of literature. And remember, when we talked about the anatomy of an article, we had intro, review of lit, methods, results, discussion, conclusion. And the review of literature is the piece where we talk about all the research that's been done on the particular constructs that you're studying. And you kind of end on whatever gap there is in the literature and propose a hypothesis or a research question or whatever your approach is. This whole piece of body here in the review of literature does not have direct quotes. Scientific writing has very few. The exceptions are things like definitions. Like if it matters a whole bunch, you could potentially quote for a definition, but that is few and far between. If you open up, a stack of 10 articles, you might get one that has a direct quote. It's not a thing, okay? So even if you find the absolute best quote in a source, you need to paraphrase, okay? So rather than, for example, Sonny and Cher 1965 say, "I got you, babe," you would do something like this. Sonny and Cher 1965 assert that they'll have each other, which indicates a sort of interdependence. Notice, besides the fact that this is ridiculous, and I realize that, or I'm at least very self-amused, in which case I apologize, but you'll notice that when I directly quote, it's up to the audience to figure out why it matters. When you paraphrase, you're giving an interpretation. You are telling the audience, this is why we care, right? You're not just lifting from someone else's work and saying, they said it, cool, and moving on. You're saying, okay, they said this idea, and in the context of what we're already discussing, this is, because if I'm going to bother to say, which indicates a sort of interdependence, I assume I am going to talk about interdependence somehow. Whether I already have, or I will, or whatever it is. There, I have added something, and this is one of the major reasons that we don't use direct quotes is that we lose something, right? Okay, so it kind of forces you to think about it in terms of why does it matter? What constructs are we researching? How does it relate to the dialogue that I'm currently building? Okay, and this is exactly what it says here. Know that you provide interpretation shows me that you know more thought about the quote rather than copying and pasting it, okay? So if you're doing this kind of writing, resist quoting, please, okay? I can only think of a handful of cases where it was necessary. Another example, will you still need me? Will you still feed me when I'm 64? And then parentheses, McCartney, 1967. This is a song, if I am weird and you don't know this, it's a song. Which I would sing to you, but we're not in class and I'm not doing it for recording. Anyway, so I could do it this way instead. In McCartney 1967, the author poses the research question as to whether advanced age will affect the quality of his relationship. He hypothesized that indeed, advanced age reduces the likelihood that his partner will stay with him. And the irony is McCartney got divorced at 64, so we have an answer. Anyway, so you can see once again, when I paraphrased, right, I told you what was said instead of literally citing it, instead of literally telling you word for word. I added information here. I'm telling you that I think this is a hypothesis in this particular, well, not literally, but this is me being liberal. But I've kind of like, oh yeah, he's hypothesizing this stuff, right? I'm adding something to it. It's not literally just, and I'm using songs because this isn't really, the important part right now isn't the science piece, it's the how you do it piece, okay? So I've added something to this. It's not literally, he said a thing, good, move on. Audience must know what he meant, right? Or why it's relevant. You have to tell me why it's relevant when you write in this manner. Okay, and as I said, there'll be practice at the end. General stylistics, okay? This is sort of the stuff that pertains in that list I presented at the beginning. One of those things was that I really, really recommend you avoid using the word this in writing, especially on its own, okay? So if you can avoid it, do. And if you do use it, make sure that it is not ambiguous in the slightest. Let me show you how it can be ambiguous. So when we talk, we often use the word this as a reference to previous ideas. It's a pronoun, right? It replaces a previous thing. Such as Mary thinks John is smart. This is controversial, right? So in this case, the thing that's controversial is John being smart, okay? So we know what this refers to in this example, right? Whereas Mary thinks that an article on whales would be more effective if published on a Monday. This is controversial. What does the this stand for? And if we were sitting here in class, I would ask you to wax poetic. And I think I might still give you an example in class, but not this one. How you wax poetic, like what is this? And the reality is there's a bunch, right? It could be, this is controversial, an article on whales, that could be the thing, right? You know, it's controversial that it's an article on whales. Maybe it is an article on whales, or that an article on whales is more effective if published on a Monday. That whole proposition could be what's controversial, or it could be simply, you know, publishing on Monday, right? So this can be lots of chunks, right? The pronoun can replace different sizes, different types of phrases. You know, it can replace a lot of stuff because it replaces propositions for the most part. It could be nouns too, I guess. Ergo, it's ambiguous. We don't want to do that. Now, here's my example again. What else can you do, right? So if you think it's an article on whales, right? Oh yeah, so this is simply, so if we knowing which one this refers to, you can vastly change the argument. So so you can restate this some version of the thing itself. So when this is supposed to be an article on whales, I can say, Mary thinks an article on whales is more effective published on a Monday. I would say such an article is controversial, right? So now I'm talking about a different article would have been better. Or if this was supposed to be that an article on whales is more effective published on a Monday, Mary thinks on a Monday, Mary's expectation of all that stuff is controversial. You're suggesting that something that contradicts the entirety of that proposition, right? Or if this is supposed to be, if published on a Monday, then I could say it instead, Mary thinks that an article published in Wales is more effective, Mary thinks an article on whales is more effective published on a Monday. Publishing on a Monday is controversial. Just say a different day is better, right? So the word this is ambiguous, okay? You can sort of restate the thing. If you're tempted to use the word this in writing, I recommend you restate the thing, okay? It won't always work, but it'll usually work, okay? This is a good practice because it pares down, it reduces ambiguity, okay? And so then the person reading your paper, your article, whatever, will have a better sense of what you're talking about. There are a few cases where this is very easy to interpret, such as the one I gave you first. Mary thinks John is smart. This is controversial. You know, it is hard as an author, though, to know for sure when it is easy to interpret. You can hand it to a couple people if you really want to know, or if you're in doubt, just substitute, right? You know, Mary thinks John is smart. This opinion, right? And I can use the word this if it's not by itself. This opinion, right? It's just the word this is just too vague. It's a pronoun. It replaces too many things, okay? Briefly, I asked you to avoid first-person language, right? Article style writing conventions typically use non-personal writing, avoiding things like I found or I believe, right? There are exceptions in mostly limited situations where the author is discussing what they've done as original work. Like I propose, we propose, sometimes you can say I study. Usually it's for like proposals or, you know, but we still talk about ourselves in third person if we're talking about our own research, right? Like if I wanted to say, Heil 2015, blah, 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 blah. Even if it's my paper, I'll talk about myself that way. That's pretty standard, right? It's more professional to not do it that way. That being said, there are people who can use first person. So if you see it, don't think that I'm a liar. It's not common, all right? This, once again, the use of first person is what this means, is a tricky line to walk around early academic writers. And once again, until you figured it out, really, I would avoid it, okay? And if when in doubt, ask me, or if you are writing in a different context, ask whoever you would consider your mentor or a writing center or whatever. And avoiding weak language, again, just sort of to strengthen it, not so much about ambiguity, it kind of is about ambiguity too, but about sort of it's a question of finesse, is what I've said here, I suppose. You get better at with time, but in academic writing, directness is valued. So instead of saying Smith 1990 said, and you really should decide what Smith is doing when he said what you're about to mention, right? So for example, consider Smith 1990 claimed. He made a statement, doesn't specify how he got there, and it leaves room for you to observe, to disagree, right? He claimed. If I say so and so claimed, I'm usually about to be like, and they're wrong, right? So if I say claim in the class, you should take that as a clue I don't agree. Smith 1990 proposed. They made a hypothesis or a data interpretation. Smith 1990 observed. He made a statement. It doesn't specify how he got there, and it leaves room for you to disagree, right? In some sense, it's like claimed, except for claimed, I probably disagree. Observed. So actually what I said here leaves room for you to agree. You could still disagree, but I think if you say observed, you usually are about to be like, yeah, he's right, you know? So claimed, you often are going to be like, and observed, you're usually going to be like, So notice, said doesn't tell me any of this stuff. Not a thing. Whereas claim, proposed, observed tells me a lot of stuff. So different words in this category. Here's a couple I just gave you, plus it's, his findings support, his findings don't support, his findings suggest, which is weaker and a little bit more tentative. Like suggest is very important because sometimes findings show something, but specifically, we don't want to say that we know something for sure, because you need to study and study and study and study and study and study and study something for us to be truly convinced by it, right? And suggest is a good way to admit that we don't know for sure. And calls into question is like, the negative of suggest, like suggesting not, right? So this finding calls into question so-and-so's theory, right? These are really good ways to talk that are not weak. These are strong ways to talk about ideas. And please never use the word prove. Never, ever, 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 ever. We don't prove things in science. We just don't. And we'll talk a little bit about this when we get to like falsifiability and like philosophy of science, that piece of it. But we don't prove things in science. It's just not how it works. And so if you don't believe me, wait for falsifiability. But it really has to do with the fact that how do we know what we know? And I think we tend to think we know things based on very little evidence, and we do not. Okay. All right, the last thing I wanted to mention before we do the practice is headers. This is just an example to kind of see what it looks like. If you're writing in this format, it is a better idea in most cases. And so this was the thing about car color and personalities that I proposed back in the anatomy of an article. And the first section of that was on personality, I believe, or something like that. And so in this sample, you'll notice, and again, I'm using songs as pretend sources here because there's no sources. I just made it up. But like Captain Tennille and Humperdinck is an actual, what is his first name? Something ridiculous. Engelbert Humperdinck, which isn't his real name. Engelbert Humperdinck was a composer back in the day, like Baroque era. And Engelbert Humperdinck in the 70s was another singer that used that as sort of a pseudonym. But these are songs. Again, there's Sonny and Cher, there's McCartney again. Anyway, so you'll notice that here I've used an actual header, like a number one, boop, to mark off the section that talks about the first construct. The use of this it creates clarity, it increases the ability to read stuff, and you'll notice it reduces the need for transitions. So I can say, oh, in order to relate to personalities first, it's kind of I'm reading the first line after the one. It does help a little, you might use a little bit of a transition just for niceties, but in this sort of format, the transitions are in some sense disruptive and wordy and lengthened. Again, we want to know directly, clearly, and simply most of the time, what is the relationship between the constructs? Because me as a reader, this article is going to be 30 pages long. Do I really want to spend an extra couple minutes cumulatively reading about, okay, let's talk about my next section? No, just give me a header and move on, right? It's just not really how we write. It reminds me actually, Dana talks about when she, I don't know if this still happens, at least she used to, I think she might still, in Lin317 in child language acquisition, she used to and maybe still does ask students to write reports, and it has like sections. And she laments the fact that students write the report as if they think they're writing a 5-paragraph essay, whereas a report literally has heading, write about the thing, heading, write about the thing, with emphasis on the data and the facts and the conclusions and whatever, and not spending all this effort about transitions and such. Because when we're talking from a scientific point of view, your fluff means nothing to me, So anyway, headers, very useful to kind of get right into the next section really clearly, really easily, and quickly, as a matter of fact. Okay, practice. So if you have jumped ahead intrepidly, here is a section of practice that has more to do with the skills and what you'll be asked to be doing in the section. So here is a particular article. You're not fixing the article. This is the end citation. You're not fixing the end citation. You're about to fix the in-text citation. Ready? So this article is about the pizza industry, and so I've made a ridiculous claim based upon this, specifically John eating too many pizzas. And so the first example is John eats too many pizzas, and then I cited this article as evidence, which it's not, but let's imagine. And then a second one, as if I'm talking about the article. So, Hay et al. 2013 study whether John eats too many pizzas. Okay, the citation portion of number 1 and number 2 is wrong. So take a second, pause, whatever you need to do, and then we'll talk about what it should look like. And now that you've unpaused, okay, the first one should look like this. So more than 2 authors, we should be using et al. So Hay et al., presumably Hay or something like that, 2013. And maybe one of our students who knows some Chinese could tell me exactly how that's said or something close to it. But this is my approximation. I apologize. But anyway, Hay et al. Period, comma, 2013. Okay, that's the one where I haven't directly put the authors into the sentence structure. Whereas number 2, they are, right? I'm actually saying the author's name as I'm talking. It should look like this. The only real difference is we need parentheses. Okay. One more pair of examples. All right, so this article is about chocolate milk. I was picking random things from Google Scholar, and it says as a post-exercise recovery aid. Cool. All right. So here are my two in-text citations. So Karp Johnston et al. 2006 told me to drink more chocolate milk. Okay. Or I will drink more chocolate milk due to science. And Karp et al. 2006. Okay. There is an error in each of these, and once again, pause, do whatever you need to do, or on the fly, and then we will look at the answer together. And now unpausing. The first one, the issue is that, once again, it isn't et al., but you only mention the first author in et al. Okay, so it's Karp et al. 2006. And then the second one, the issue is the comma, nothing more. Okay, if you have questions on this, let me know. This is the kind of thing you need to be able to do for this particular skill, which means on the homework as well.